Welcome everyone to these lectures on Indian writing in English. I'm Umashankar Patra. In the last lecture, we stopped with Macaulay's infamous, notorious minutes, which results in English becoming the language of instruction in India. Today, we'll start with that pivotal point and try to go back in history to look at other roles that English has played in India. For that survey of what all other roles English has played in India, uh, a chapter by Vinay Dharwadkar from this book edited by Sheldon Pollock. It's an influential study on India called Literary Cultures in History, Reconstruction from South Asia. It has a chapter on Indian writing in English by Vinay Dharwadkar. And that chapter actually is a survey of Indian writing in English. Vinay Dharwadkar takes us on this journey and he identifies four very important zones. Those four zones, he tells us, were the sites of acculturation of English in India itself. How English became part of the Indian life itself, and how the entire negotiation that was surrounding English was not only taking place through the bureaucratic or colonial governance machinery itself. We will start this reconstruction with help of Vinay Dharwadkar and others. I will refer to certain portions in Vinay Dharwadkar's essay. As I said, it's quite a wonderful survey. It's a longish chapter in Sheldon Pollock's book, and we will look at those four zones one after the other, and those zones are very instructive to our understanding of English's sociology of English in India and anthropology of English in India, and to a general social life of English in India itself. So through that reconstruction, we'll try to also look at many important voices in the early stages of social life of English in India. We'll look at writers leading up till that pivotal point of 1835, post which we will venture into looking at novel written in English itself. In this lecture, we'll look at those four zones and also look at what is considered as the first English work written by an Indian, Dean Mohammad's Travels. So let's begin that survey. According to Dharwadkar, the first zone that he identifies are the zones of employment. We'll look at those zones of employment as the first category of contact zones between English and India. As you will remember, Father Estevam or Father Thomas Stephens arrives in 1578, but the British come to our shores after that. Primarily in the 17th and 18th century, the British are interacting with the Mughal Darbar or the Mughal government via a category of people known as the Dubashis, the Dubashish, or as they are known as in other words, they are known as the Dubash. people who know two languages. These were primarily the clerk interpreters that they had. So, one of the first categories that we have when we look at uh, English and the Indian interaction is the category of the Dubash. The Dubash is the clerk interpreter, as I said, one who helped the British negotiate, understand the Mughal court or the Mughal rule itself, interacting with the market, Indian people, and the Mughal governance system itself when the British come to Bengal and Madras. So, that is the first category that we need to understand, the clerk interpreter. The second is all these British officials, and we are talking about the East India Company here, please remember that. The British officials also have someone as their personal agents, one who doubles up or occupies multiple roles as a bookkeeper, as a personal agent, a secretary, as someone who manages their money and also secrets. That personal agent many times colloquially is known also as the baniya. Also doubles up at the clerk, their personal clerks. But as you will remember, because of the corruption in the first half of the East India Company's life in India, the impeachment trials against Warren Hastings and others, the corruption charges led to a banishment of these Dubash from formal employment of the British. Because the idea, as you remember, we discussed in the last lecture, was about these people corrupting the British officials, and the corruption was enabled by these Dubashes. We'll read a section from Vinay Dharwadkar. Yes, as you can see, Dharwadkar quotes P.J. Marshall, who reminds us that all Europeans of any consequence employed baniyas. Nominally, their status was servile and they performed submenial tasks such as managing their master's household and his personal spending. But the baniya of a prominent European was a man to be reckoned with. The governor's baniya presided over a court in Calcutta. Men like Gokul Ghoshal, a Kulin Brahmin, baniya to Harry Verslet or Chantu Babu, Krishnakanta Nandi, baniya to Warren Hastings were among the richest and most influential members of Indian community in Calcutta. What this passage from P.J. Marshall reminds us is the negotiation as we were talking about. So what one sees here, and this is what I was talking about, besides and beyond the governmental life of English in India, this is the social life we are talking about. And these are people who are associated with the British Raj in different kind of capacity. As we said, the clerk interpreter was a formal employee. But the banyan, who was a kind of a kind of a PA or supplier of cash, interpreter, head bookkeeper, as he says, head secretary, head broker, the supplier of cash, or generally a secret keeper, now was giving the colonial master subject discourse a different kind of turn. As the person is the secret keeper of the British master, he also holds a certain agency. Now, that changes and alters, not entirely, but the notion of the master and servant. While these things, with the coming of Cornwallis, as we are talking about, the system of governance changes. The Duwash, though, is there in the system itself, but they transform into uh, scholars and interpreters uh, who go on to become uh, the indigenous scholar. In the course of 18th century, the three types of Duvashis appear: the clerk interpreter, the personal manager, and the indigenous scholar. Embodiment of Indian multilingualism in motion inside the zones of employment with the British. As Dharwadkar reminds us that they were the first Indians to become literate in English. These Dubashis go on to work with the Orientalist, even if Orientalism does not receive the kind of patronage as it did with Warren Hastings. They go on to work with many these kinds of Dubashis. One of them will talk about in a bit, C.V. Buraiya, who worked with Colin Mackenzie in terms of the person who was responsible for survey of India and the heritage of India. So these Dubashis associated themselves formally with these kind of English bureaucrats. So even if their positions are formally not associated as clerk interpreters per se as they were in the first half of British Empire, they later are still associated. So the Dubashi, the interpreter, the comprador as they were known, becomes the figure of first literate in English in India. There are other kinds of employment that happens, and again, Dharwadkar perceptively tells us about them. If this was happening at the zones of employment formally and in terms of governance, there was something else also happening in other parts of the English life in India. By English life, here I mean the British life in India, and this was in the domestic sphere. I'm sure if any document or any narrative, if we have come across from the colonial times in India, one would have read accounts of the domestic servants that were present in the British government bungalows and the houses. One very interesting thing that comes to my mind here is the kind of, and this comes almost towards the end of the Raj, one sees a kind of nostalgia for these kind of domestic servants and the kind of domestic life that the British had here. As Dharwadkar tells us that after 1725 it became social obligatory. So it became socially obligatory for the Englishmen in India to maintain large domestic retinues in the notorious Nabob style. So what we have is that the British were maintaining these large retinues of servants who would be in their service. The book that comes to my mind is by Charles Allen, Plain Tales from the Raj, where he compiles these accounts of colonial nostalgia about these nobodies of the empire in that sense. But one would see the kind of interaction, and it's unavoidable to see the role of the language there, that many of them have picked up language. Many of them have a personal relationship with these British rulers, and many of them go on to be treated like family members. One of our writers that we'll discuss a bit later in the lectures, Din Muhammad, was taken up by a British official, Godfrey Van Baker, at the age of 11, and he's taken to Cork in Ireland. He settles down there. with the help of Baker himself. So we see a very interesting zone of interaction evolving here, which is the domestic sphere. Here, it is very important, and then that's why I was talking about the colonial nostalgia, which comes after the Raj is almost towards its end, or almost after, and also after India gains independence, to tell you about the long life of this zone itself. As I was talking about Deen Mohammed, the other domain that he identifies as zones of employment is the company army. The company army employed a assortment of people, which also included Europeans, Africans, and Asian soldiers. One of those examples is Deen Mohammed himself, who learns English thanks to this exposure. And Deen Mohammed is 11 when he joins Baker. So one needs to understand that this zone of employment, one would think that because it is so hierarchical, it would probably be very rigid. But as I have been giving examples of the Dubashes as secret keepers, or people who are very powerful, as P.J. Marshall would tell us, or from colonial nostalgia, these zones of employment also led to unexplored and unexpected relationships between the British and the Indians, between the English and the vernaculars, where a certain kind of pidgin English developed, which meant words, broken phrases were negotiated, applied, and used across the board, which meant English was adapted by Indians. English was used by Indians, probably not proficiently, as one would have thought, but in most cases, English was domesticated in that sense. The other sphere that one can look at here, as Dharwadkar tells us, the next one is that of the zone of marriage and family. The zone of marriage and family is very interesting again, and it draws from that kind of a social relationship that we were talking about earlier, that these led to the British presence in India led to very different kind of unexpected zones of contact. One of them happens to be this, and as we are told, a total of over 17th century, total of several hundred English women came out to India for various reasons, but at any given moment, number of English men exceeded the number of English women on the subcontinent by a factor of many. But one very crucial factor was the church had prohibited Christians from marrying non-Christians. So Englishmen made ingenious alternative arrangements. As I said, very unexpected, unexplored zones were being explored right then. Some married European women of other nationalities. Some married widows, daughters of Portuguese men, since the widows, mostly women of Hindu origin, were also converts to Christianity, and the daughters were Luso Indians raised as Christians. Some took Indian wives who had converted to Christianity before the marriages could be solemnized, and some, willing to live with the social consequences of their decision, took Indian mistresses who did not have to be subjected to conversion. So, we have very different kind of subjectivities now arising out of these mixed marriages between mixed races, where they can be Hindu women who were converted, Hindu women who were widows, there were Christians of different nationalities, and some who did not convert but stayed on as mistresses of these white men. All of them, interestingly, had access to some or the other European languages, and primarily in this case, the English language itself. As C.A. Bailey estimates, by 1788, there were more than 11,000 mestizos living in the British coastal territories. 11,000. Not all of it in India, but British coastal territories. Most of them children of these interracial marriages. And these mestizos, as we know them, go on to also shape many of our literary worlds. We have many writers who are beneficiaries of these zones of contact, as again Dean Mohammed appears here, married to Jane Daly. Henry Derozio, the first poet of Indian English literature, was the son of a Luso-Indian father, a Portuguese Indian father, and the English mother. Then we have Michael Madhusudan Dutt, a seminal figure of 19th century Bengal, who married a Scottish woman and then a French woman, who greatly influenced his writing. We then, if this was the history till 19th century, we have so many writers in the 20th and 21st century who are part of this zone of interaction. Anita Desai, Dom Morris, Eunice D'Souza, Ruskin Bond, to name only a very few of these writers. So one can again see, like the zone of employment, the zone of marriages and contact, making a big impact and taking the story of English in India forward. One very interesting text that we can think about in this respect would be E.M. Foster's Passage to India, where this kind of a social relationship takes a different turn, where Adela Quested comes to India to get married to a white bureaucrat, Ronnie Heaslop, and there are very interesting conversations, and finally that climatic point where Adela Quested is taken to the Maravar caves by Dr. Aziz, and then something happens there, a mysterious thing that happens there, kind of a black hole of the novel, represents to us the other side of this interaction, the other side of this social relationship, which marks the racial lines, marks those racial lines pretty well, distinctively, and yet it also tells us the possibility that remains between the Indians and the British in terms of forging some kind of a relationship which may or may not be sexual. We will look at those relationships also in the next lecture. Thank you.